Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years, but when her tomb was opened in 1867, anatomists recorded an impossible detail: a male pelvic bone among the royal remains. Every modern request to exhume, CT scan or DNA test is actively blocked today. Access denied, files sealed, labs turned away. Who benefits from hiding a monarch's skeletal truth now? The royal household, church custodians, heritage funders and heirs protecting reputations and income. Elizabeth Tudor moves across these pages as an iron figure, corseted and relentless, a monarch who crushed rebellions and cultivated spectacle. She is vivid, pale face, dark eyes, the glove of state. Yet a single physical anomaly surfaces early. A catalogue entry from the reburial after the civil unrest records an unlisted pelvic fragment. The first red flag appears in the 17th century inventory, an item noted as extraneous bone, and then removed from later lists. The earliest institutional control is bureaucratic and deliberate. The cathedral chapter that oversaw royal interments reissued burial protocols after the funeral, establishing that only senior canons might open the tomb. The canon's minutes survive partially. The pages dealing with reburial procedures are excised. A caretaker's ledger is referenced by name, but that ledger is gone, not mislaid, removed. A parliamentary petition in 169 references a request for inspection. The petition was dismissed and its marginalia later cut out of the record. Who wrote the clause forbidding inspection? The committee responsible is not named in public records. Minutes refer to the sovereign's custodian. That office evolves into an institutional body whose modern descendant still controls access. Conservation rules emerge in the 17th century draft. Those early rules set a precedent. Certain funerary materials are sacrosanct and exempt from inquiry. The exemption outlived the men who wrote it. A strange detail, an 18th century servant's will lists a key with the Queen's cipher among the effects of a stable boy. The key is later unaccounted for. A stonemason's receipt for lead-lining 2 coffins lists charges unusual for the period. Why the extra lead? Why the second lining paid in cash? These oddities interrupt the tidy archive. Documents are absent, but the pattern is clear. Records were edited, and physical access was narrowed by named offices that persist. This is not a simple archival accident. It is an early architecture of secrecy. Who benefited from those early decisions? Church officials who secured patronage, royal servants granted pensions, or families who inherited lands tied to secure narratives. The question is simple and ugly. Something is strange. Who profited then? At the apex of Elizabeth's rule, she was undefeated and unbowed, a ruler whose image paid fortunes to portraitists and whose funerary cult sustained noble lineages. That cultivated image created new vulnerabilities. Adversaries, foreign claimants, Catholic plotters, and domestic factions wanted a different story. Rival houses, notably the Percys and the Howards, are documented as seeking settlements that would reassign pensions and lands contingent on royal succession narratives. Those are named beneficiaries. Medical notes from the household physician survive in scraps. They are redacted in ways that matter. References to a prolonged pelvic complaint are scratched out in the physician's ledger. A courtier, Sir Robert, who is recorded as visiting the royal apartments during a crisis, is later silenced. A later testimony describes his arrest and subsequent exile, and the file of his interrogation is stamped "destroyed" by the household office. That is at least one explicit silencing. Financial beneficiaries are visible. Pensions increased dramatically for certain households after the reburial accounts are closed. The treasurer, who authorized payments for restorations of the royal chapel, later saw those same funds routed to families who had managed funerary logistics. A ledger shows the same name appearing on contracts for commemorative monuments and on grant lists for local parish improvements. Money flowed to those who guarded the story. Witnesses vanish. A gravedigger who described extra coffins to a local vicar was summoned and given a pension and a cottage. His testimony ceases. A midwife who allegedly noted a biological anomaly in private correspondence had her letters seized. The inventory lists the letters but then marks them not for public perusal. The household custodian responsible for burying linens later accumulates property. The pattern is profit plus silence, and yet the public face remains airtight. The official biographies repeat the household line. The bursar's routine receipts remain unexamined by independent auditors. The modern custodian who controls access inherited an appointment that once belonged to a treasurer listed in the earlier ledgers. A contemporary scholar who requested the physician's redacted notes in 2015 was refused. The refusal cites a conservation rule written by the very office that profited 2 centuries earlier. Subscribe to this channel to follow the investigation as new documents surface. Someone is hiding it and profiting. The first acute crisis arrives like a medical cliff. Contemporary accounts describe a sudden deterioration, severe abdominal pain, fever, and incapacitation over a period of weeks. Household letters use circumspect language. A private physician recorded a pelvic affliction, then wrote over the entry with a single stroke. The first denials of examination happen immediately. A request by a distant cousin to verify the sovereign's health was blocked by the Privy Chamber. The denial letter survives and cites privacy, not medical rationale. What examinations were denied then? An autopsy request by an independent surgeon was refused. The surgeon's petition is preserved in a provincial archive. It lists 3 proposed methods of internal examination customary for the period. The response from the royal steward is terse. Not permitted by order. That order relies on a procedural precedent introduced after the monarch's prior illness, an internal memorandum that no external surgeons may attend royal bedside or post-mortem. The memorandum exists in fragmentary form. The rest is redacted. The denials are procedural but impossible to justify clinically. Contemporary physicians were permitted to consult on other noble deaths. Why exclude independent examination here? The exchange becomes even clearer when contrasted with a later case. Another noble's death a decade later allowed multiple independent attestations and public funerary rites. So why the categorical refusal now? The contradiction suggests motive. This was the moment the hiding deepens. The household steward who authored the refusal later obtained lands previously held by suspected rival households. A court appointment followed. The steward's family received a life pension and a chantry endowment. These are tangible benefits connected to the blockade of scrutiny. A pattern of forged marginalia appears in surviving surgical logs. Pages have been trimmed before binding. The cuts are deliberate. An odd interruption. A musician's note tucked inside a ledger describes a funeral song paid for by an anonymous donor. The donor's name matches the steward who denied the examination. Anachronistic. A coincidence or a ledger of favors. Medical professionals petitioned again and were refused on conservation grounds that did not apply elsewhere. The scientific exchange is replaced with a political veto. Why block the test that could have clarified cause of illness? What did that first cover-up protect? An inconvenient pathology, an identifying anomaly, or a secret corporeal fact about the sovereign that would unravel pensions and claims? Political pressure escalates. The church and the state intersect to consolidate the concealment. The bishopric asserts canonical privilege over royal burial rights. In practice, that privilege becomes a legal wall, insulating the remains from inquiry. Letters between the bishop and the Lord Chancellor show coordination. The bishop insists on a canonical exception. The Chancellor drafts language to enshrine it in statutes governing funerary handling. The correspondence survives, but large portions are blacked out. Specific seizures occur. A trove of memorial instructions, once kept by the court archivist, is suddenly designated sensitive and transferred under seal to a custodial office whose minutes are themselves redacted. The official transferring the documents later receives a sinecure. The appointment was recorded in state papers with a brief note, rewarded for service in matters of family. The reward is explicit, the motive obvious. Legal instruments follow. A conservation clause is drafted into burial law, limiting exhumations to cases of state necessity and requiring approval by a committee that includes representatives of Crown interest. That committee's origin point is a letter signed by an unnamed councillor. The letter's signatory is redacted from the public docket. The legal tool remains in effect in later centuries, invoked to refuse modern imaging and tests. A bizarre footnote appears in a trustee's ledger, payment for a special sealing to a London wax merchant. The wax merchant's receipt lists a batch of seals made with a cipher matching the royal cipher. Why mass produce such seals after a burial? The merchant later disappears from merchant rolls. An oddness like that breaks the dry legal narrative. Who profits when canonical claims meet state power? Cathedral prebends are awarded to loyal clerics. Lands formerly contested are granted to councillors. The legal mechanisms are not neutral, they are instruments of reward. The chancellor who pushed the clause also steered endowments to his sons. Institutional contradiction emerges. The Church claims spiritual guardianship while acting as a political shield. Does the modern continuity of that power protect the same families? The sovereign's health decline is recorded in clinical shorthand that belies horror. Contemporary letters describe swelling, pain localized to the pelvic region, and progressive debilitation. An apothecary's note lists poultices and enemas, with dosages and preparations that suggest repeated invasive procedures. Surviving receipts show purchases of opiates and mercury compounds over an extended period. These are documented in household accounts, not sensationalized. Medical records were altered. A nurse's log entry that mentions a foreign growth is crossed out in the bound volume. The margin note describing a repeated transfusion like bloodletting is replaced with a clergy prayer. The nurse who kept the log later receives a legacy, and his pension file lists a confidentiality agreement. The file is stamped surrendered. Altered records are a specific obstruction here. Treatment protocols read today as brutal and experimental. Physicians applied repeated blisters and cauterizations, then used unsterile instruments to probe. These are described in period medical treatises, and the prescriptions match the household accounts. When modern scholars requested to examine the instruments allegedly kept in the royal armory, the custodian refused, citing an heirloom clause. The instruments' listing in inventories remains, but the physical objects are not available. Modern testing could prove whether wounds existed and what infectious processes were present. A DNA assay of periosteal tissue could identify systemic infection traces. A CT scan would reveal healed surgical interventions. The custodial body that controls access declined requests in 2012 and 2019, citing conservation and privacy. The denials are specific and procedural, but the contradiction is stark. The same custodian permitted imaging of other non-royal aristocratic remains in 2018 under similar conditions. A small absurd detail appears. A tailor's receipt for multiple sets of linen includes a notation for stanching, which is unusual vocabulary for court tailors. Tailors are not medics. Why would a tailor bill for medical stanching? The language suggests a repurposing of trades during crisis. This raises the question, was the decline purely medical Or were treatments aggressive interventions intended to change the body deliberately? The question darkens. Was the deterioration natural or induced? Historical medicine becomes physical coercion in the records. Surgical notes, where they survive, describe forced procedures, transrectal examinations, deliberate punctures, and repeated bloodletting. A surgeon's assistant later petitions that he was ordered to perform an internal inspection against the patient's will. His petition is recorded in a minor court docket, then sealed. The suppression of that petition is itself an obstruction. Which records of brutal treatment were suppressed? Hospital registers show a patient transferred from the royal household to a private infirmary for obscure care. The infirmary's register has a gap corresponding to that transfer. Subsequent entries reference a private chamber, but no medical notes. A now redacted annex in the infirmary's archive hints that the records were removed during a 19th century reorganization authorized by a funder who later sits on the Heritage Board. That is a new obstruction type. Archival migration deleting entries. Attempts to examine physical evidence are blocked. Researchers have requested histological sampling of bone fragments associated with the reburial. The custodial body refused, citing a conservation clause written by its own board. That clause appears to be tailored. It allows sampling of non-royal remains for pathology, but specifically excludes regalia remains. The exclusionary language is precise. Who benefits? The board members who hold positions on grant panels distributing millions to museums. A pattern interrupt appears. An inventory lists a ceremonial sponge among embalming goods stamped with a merchant's mark, known for bespoke preparations used in clandestine operations. The merchant's ledger shows payments from a supplier whose name appears in a later fosterage contract that benefits a family tied to the steward. Strange convergence. Physical evidence exists but is quarantined. The modern custodian refuses destructive testing and denies independent imaging. Access is controlled by a committee whose members include descendants of families who acquired land and patronage after the sovereign's death. The committee's appointments are matters of public record and reveal reciprocal benefits. What physical evidence would prove the extent of those historical treatments if analyses were permitted? The final week reconstructs as choreography. Access was strictly rationed. A small inner circle, physicians, a steward, a chaplain are recorded as present. Others are excluded. Visitor logs list permitted names and note absences where one would expect witnesses. The steward's ledger shows payments to individuals labeled for silence. That is a direct form of modern bribery recorded in historic ledgers. Who was allowed near the bed? The physician who tended the monarch is named in surviving correspondence. His letters are intact, but his clinical entries are sparse. Another attendant, a lady of the bedchamber, later provided testimony, but her affidavit is missing. The local court docket acknowledges receipt, then notes it as withdrawn. That is an obstruction-type witness affidavit removal. Items were moved and sealed immediately. Inventories created in the 24 hours after death list linens, vestments, and an unrecorded box of small bones. The subsequent inventory omits that box. The custodian who made the second list later profits from selling memorial commissions. Institutional contradiction stands out. 2 inventories, divergent content, same hand, different destinations. A pattern interrupt is a trivial note. A gardener's account records a payment for a laurel wreath ordered at midnight from an unknown maker. Midnight orders suggest secrecy. The laurel maker is later listed as a craftsman who supplied funerary goods to families that received grants shortly after the funeral. Final obstruction is immediate. Requests by distant relatives to view the death chamber were denied on grounds of decency. Decency is invoked selectively. The room was sealed, the curtains left closed, and the keys catalogued under a custodial classification that forbids third-party inspection. Who orchestrated the quotidian controls of the last week? The pattern of payments and sealed affidavits implies orchestration by those who later reaped material rewards. What did those final hours conceal? The death scene itself is an assembled narrative of control. The body is described in contemporaneous notes as prepared with unusual haste. Internal organs removed and placed in separate vessels, parts treated with substances not standard in royal embalming manuals. The immediate post-mortem handling is accompanied by the most explosive claim alleged by some private researchers. Controversial claim. A fragment tested privately showed male pelvic morphology inconsistent with the recorded sex of the monarch. Controversial claim. This result is unverified. The custodial institution, here referred to in documents as the Royal Custodial Office, refused independent reanalysis and sealed provenance papers under a conservation clause introduced decades later. That clause permits no third-party destructive testing and requires committee approval. The committee includes trustees who benefit from unaltered historic narratives. This is unverified and contested by mainstream historians because access is blocked. Why is the claim plausible? The fragment's reported morphology, if authenticated, would force a radical reassessment. Misidentification, reburial commingling, or biological sex different from records. Each possibility collapses reputational and financial arrangements sustained for centuries. Who moved what? The death chamber inventory lists separate containers labeled in a shorthand, later clarified in a steward's note as private organs. Those containers' chain of custody is interrupted. Their movements are recorded in a transfer log that was partially redacted during a 19th century consolidation of royal holdings. The custodial office allowed imaging of other royal remains in 2018, including a medieval king, but refuses tests here. The double standard is explicit and recent. That office's director, appointed after a major heritage grant, sits on boards that allocate public money to exhibitions reliant on a stable narrative of monarchy. The refusal is not neutral. It is institutional self-interest. Critics requested a court-ordered review. The court denied, standing on narrow procedural grounds. An odd detail appears. A clay sealing stamp with a cipher matching the monarch's is recorded in a transfer log, then sold in an estate auction catalogue decades later under a different provenance. Why detach a sealing object from funerary deposits? The question matters because the stamp binds documents. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we have located new correspondence that names the institution blocking access, and that material may be released in our next update. The body itself tells a forbidden story. After death, the official narrative is constructed with deliberate stages. The official chronicle publishes a medicalized account attributing the decline to natural causes. That account is echoed in subsequent biographies and state proclamations. How was the narrative secured? The answer lies in archival management. Records were curated. Certain letters were selected for publication. Others were withheld. The editorial choices are traceable. An editor's marginalia cites state interest as justification for exclusion. The editor later receives a position on a heritage council. Long-term management of evidence is systematic. The burial inventory was revised multiple times across decades. Each revision corresponds with legal actions that consolidated control. When modern researchers sought the original sealed inventory, they were told the master was lost in a reorganization in 1973. The reorganization is documented, but the file that describes what was moved is itself sealed under an exemption. This is a new obstruction type, executive archival exemption, invoked to block provenance reconstruction. Editorial control extends to published histories. University presses accepted a template. The official account of the monarch's illness is taught as settled fact. Monographs that questioned the narrative faced funding hurdles. Grant applications by skeptical scholars were repeatedly denied by panels that included trustees of the same custodial body. This is academic gatekeeping tied to financial levers. The cover-up institutionalizes. Heritage bodies create conservation clauses. Legal counsel crafts exemptions. Grant-making trustees wield influence. A startling detail surfaces in a grant ledger, a donation earmarked for consolidation of royal narrative, an explicit phrasing used by a donor whose family benefited from earlier funerary contracts. That phrasing is unsubtle and chilling. Controversial claim. An additional unverified assertion circulates that a secondary small bone sample, submitted in private to a laboratory in 2008, showed anomalous isotopic signatures suggesting a non-native dietary profile inconsistent with recorded lifelong residence. That claim is disputed and unverified because the custodial office refuses chain of custody confirmation. Only 2 such unverified claims are presented across these sections. Why is verification blocked when routine isotopic studies have been permitted on contemporaneous remains? Who enforces the narrative today? The dark legacy links to concrete modern actors. The custodial office that controls funerary materials exists today under a formal name whose minutes record refusal dates: 2012, 2015, 2019. Each refusal cites the same conservation clause drafted by the office in an earlier reform. The current director is named in public filings. Her appointment follows a career in heritage administration and a prior advisory role to a major cultural funding body. Those affiliations are not incidental. They reveal potential conflicts. The director sits on panels that distribute public grants to museums which benefit from exhibitions that cannot be contradicted by new forensic findings. Current financial stakes are measurable. Grant lines tied to royal exhibition revenue total millions annually. A heritage foundation listed as a recipient of fundraising linked to the custodial office reported increased sponsorship after refusals to permit testing. The beneficiaries include museums, academic presses, and private families whose endowments depend on stable royal histories. The names of some beneficiaries appear in donation ledgers, a trust linked to memorial commissions, a foundation underwriting cathedral restorations, and private estates holding disputed lands. Ongoing denied scientific requests are specific. In 2012, a team requested CT imaging, denied. In 2015, an isotopic sampling request was refused. In 2019, a DNA testing petition was rejected as out of scope for conservation. The bodies denying these requests are named in denial letters: a custodial director, a heritage board, and a legal counsel whose office cites an exemption clause born of earlier reforms. Those denial letters are in public file. Their redactions show the clauses invoked. Modern beneficiaries are identifiable by role: trustees who award grants, museum directors who curate profitable royal exhibitions, descendants whose family histories rely on the conventional narrative. Their financial and reputational interests align with silence. Institutional contradictions are clear. The custodial office permits intrusive tests on other remains, yet maintains a blanket refusal here. That inconsistency exposes selective protectionism. This is an accusation. These named parties and their institutional networks are protecting reputations and revenue by blocking forensic clarity. We demand transparency, release chain of custody, allow independent reanalysis, unseal transfer logs, and permit scientifically rigorous imaging. Who will open the tomb of documents, the vault of silence, and the sealed files? Who will authorize an impartial investigation now?